You know, I've had some weird nights as an ambulance driver, but this one still makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was a night shift, quiet, too quiet. Then around 3 a.m. we get this call. 62-year-old guy collapsed, at home, not breathing. The weird thing, we didn't even know who called it in. It was like the caller didn't want to be known. Spooky, right? But we didn't have time to think about that. A man's life was on the line. The voice on the other end of the line, something was off. The guy was freaking out, but get this, he refused to do CPR, flat out refused. Can you believe that? I remember the call taker's voice on the recording trying to stay calm. Sir, an ambulance is on its way. We just need you to do CPR, okay? The voice came back, shaky but firm. They kept pressing him. You can do this. I'm going to talk you through it. Please, sir, just follow my instructions. But all they got was, no, please hurry. I'm all alone. And then the line went dead, just like that. So my partner and I rushed to the address, heart pounding, you know? We get there and the place is locked up tight. Nobody answered the door, but through the window we see this guy sprawled out on the floor, not moving. And here's the kicker. There's no one. No one else in sight. We call the dispatch to ring the number back. And then the phone inside the house starts ringing. My partner and myself looking at each other like, is this really happening? But the strangest part, no one picks up. But then, just as the ringing stops, the phone receiver suddenly falls off the hook and a voice, faint, distant, starts talking. Man, my heart was in my throat. We're standing outside, staring at a house with no one in it, but there's a voice coming through the phone, as plain as a day. I pinched myself, just to make sure I wasn't dreaming. Then, when it was clear that no one was letting us in, we decided to break the glass door. We had to. This was life or death. We got inside, gear in hand, and my partner starts checking the house, but he's shaking. Can't blame him. This whole situation was like something straight out of a horror movie. Meanwhile, I rush to the guy on the floor. He's in full cardiac arrest. We slap on the defib pads and boom, first shock, nothing. Second shock, bam, he takes a breath like he's coming back from the dead, but his eyes don't open. We get him into the ambulance, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around what just happened. The police show up later to deal with the busted door, and they confirm what we already knew. The house was empty, no sign of the mysterious caller. And a few days later, we go to the hospital to see the guy. We had to know what the hell happened that night. He's sitting up in bed, looking a lot better. We ask him who he lives with, and he tells us straight up that he's been living alone for years. No family, no friends over that night, nobody. So we push a little more. Does he remember anything from that night? Anything at all? He thinks for a moment, then says, I had the strangest dream. Now, this gets us curious. We figure maybe he was half conscious and dreaming while all this was going down. Maybe his dream holds a clue, so we ask him to tell us about it. He starts like, I remember talking to someone, voice all serious. I don't know who, couldn't see his face, but I was saying that I had to go. And this stranger, he kept telling me, no, don't go yet. Help is on the way, don't go. He trails off, lost in thought. My partner and I, we both exchanged this look like, what the hell? We kept asking questions, but the guy insisted he was alone that night. The call records showed it came from inside the house, but how? Who was that voice? We never did find out who made that 911 call. To this day, it still bugs me. It doesn't make sense, does it? It's like someone or something didn't want that man to die and made sure he didn't. I'm losing my mind whenever I think about it. There's a certain type of call that makes your blood run cold before you even get there. This one was like that. My partner and myself, we were on an afternoon shift when dispatch buzzed us about a local call-out. The address? All too familiar. We had been there a dozen times before. An older woman living alone in this rundown apartment block. She was one of those regulars, always calling us out for something. But this time felt different. She was complaining about severe back pain. Nothing out of the ordinary, right? We figured it'd be another quick visit, check her out. Maybe smooth talk her into seeing a doctor and be on our way. But from the second she opened that door, I knew we were in for something else entirely. She answered the door almost before we knocked, hunched over, wincing like, she'd been through hell. And man, she wasn't faking it. The pain was real. We helped her into her chair, And as soon as she sat down, she starts talking about this pain in her back that's been haunting her for months. "Have you seen a doctor about it?" I asked, thinking that was the obvious next step. But she shook her head, looking around the room, like she was scared that someone might overhear. Then she leaned in close and whispered, "The people in my room told me not to call anyone. They said not to get help." Those words hit me like a cold breeze. I couldn't help but glance around the apartment. It was neat, nothing out of place, and from everything we knew, she had been living alone for years. But the way she said it, the way she looked at me, like she was seeing something I couldn't see. "They can see you," she said, staring right at me, with eyes that seemed too wide, too intense. "They don't like you because you're helping me. They didn't want me to call you." Then she pointed over to the recliner in the corner. I turned to look, just to humor her, but there was nothing there. Just an old, empty chair. But then, out of nowhere, the stupid thing creaked and leaned back, like someone just sat in it. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "There's no one there," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but my heart was pounding. I didn't want to stay in that apartment a second longer than we had to. "It's a good thing you called," I told her, forcing a smile. "Let's get you to the hospital, okay? So you can be checked out properly." As I helped her gather her things, I asked my partner to check the rest of the apartment, just in case. I was half hoping he would find someone hiding, some logical explanation for this woman's strange behavior and the stupid recliner. But he came back, shaking his head. Nothing. No one else was there. Even the neighbors confirmed they hadn't seen a soul come or go. We got the woman to the back of the ambulance, and I stayed with her, keeping an eye on her as we drove. But she kept looking around, all nervous-like, her eyes darting around the ambulance, and then she would stop, staring at the empty seat beside her. "Are you okay?" I asked, thinking maybe the pain was getting to her again. She looked at the seat and said, "That really does look terrible. What happened to you?" My blood ran cold. She was talking to the empty seat, and then, almost tenderly, she added, "I'm very sorry to hear that, but I'm glad you're not in pain anymore." Before I could say a word, she turned to me, her eyes wide with fear, and whispered, "He's a bit scary looking." I looked at the seat she'd been fixated on, feeling that same chill from earlier. The seat was empty, but I knew what she was talking about. Just that morning, we'd had a gruesome dispatch. Car versus semi, the poor guy hadn't made it. And that seat, that's where he'd been sitting on the way to the hospital. We got to the hospital, handed the woman over to the doctors, and went on to our next call. But I couldn't imagine what she had said. Who the hell had she been talking to in that ambulance? And what about the people in her apartment? I looked so stupid to myself. The next morning, I found out the woman had passed away during the night. Stage 4 brain cancer, the doctors said. It was too late for surgery, but they assured me she hadn't been in pain. But that wasn't what stuck with me. What I couldn't forget, what still makes me lose sleep sometimes, was the connection she had made. The disfigured man she saw in the ambulance, the one she said wasn't in pain anymore. That seat had been occupied by a dead man earlier that day. And those people in her apartment, I'll never know who or what they really were. But whatever she saw, whatever she heard in her final hours, it wasn't from this world. And sometimes I wonder, what if those people were waiting for her just on the other side? New Orleans has a way of getting under your skin, you know? It's a city soaked in history, and not all of it's the kind you'll find in textbooks. I've been a cop here for over a decade, and I've seen some things, things that'll make your blood run cold. But nothing prepared me for what I faced one night in an abandoned theater. It started out like any other call, just a routine check, but it turned into something straight out of a nightmare. It was a quiet night, too quiet for this city. We had already tossed a few drunks in the tank and handled a couple of minor incidents, but nothing major. Then we got the call, a possible break-in at a local theater. The place had been closed down since the hurricane, just a crumbling relic of what it used to be. It was the kind of spot where squatters and kids looking for trouble would hang out. I had been there a few times before, chasing out whoever was dumb enough to sneak in. I figured this time would be the same. I was dead wrong. We pulled up to the theater, and I couldn't help but shake my head. The place looked like it was barely standing. still scarred from the floodwaters. The plywood someone had used to seal the place up was half-assed at best, just propped up against the entrance. I grabbed the board, set it aside, and stepped through what used to be the front doors. The smell hit me first. That mix of mold, decay, and who knows what else. It was enough to make your stomach turn. I flashed back to my first time in this dump, almost losing my lunch because my old partner didn't warn me about the stench. I could have used some vapor rub, that's for damn sure. My partner and I clicked on our flashlights, the beams cutting through the darkness. We were standing in what used to be the foyer, where folks used to buy snacks before catching a show. Now, it was just a shadow of what it had been, a place where the light barely reached. "This is the police," I called out, hoping whoever was inside would just come out quietly. But all we got in return was the sound of dripping water somewhere deep in the belly of the building. "We have decided to check the bathrooms first." I don't know why, but we started with the men's room. The smell was even worse in there. I had to take a deep breath and hold it just to get through the door. The floor was covered in grime, the kind that sticks to your boots and makes you feel like, you need a shower. I pushed open the door to one of the stalls, trying not to gag as I glanced at the toilet. Whatever was in there was enough to make me lurch back, barely keeping my breakfast down. I stumbled to one of the sinks, turning the knob out of habit, but of course, nothing came out. I leaned over, trying to get a grip, when I caught something in the mirror. At first, I thought it was just a smudge, maybe the reflection of my flashlight. But when I wiped at it, I saw it. A face, not mine, staring back at me. My heart jumped into my throat. I spun around, shining my light toward the stalls. Nothing. I darted my eyes back to the mirror, but the only face looking back was mine. "You okay?" My partner asked, seeing the panic in my eyes. "I thought I saw someone in the mirror," I stammered. He raised an eyebrow, probably thinking I was messing with him. "You saw something in the mirror?" he repeated, doubt heavy in his voice. "Yeah, a guy's face, right behind me." He shined his light back toward the stalls, gave the mirror a quick glance, and chuckled. "You might want to get your eyes checked, partner. There's no one here but us." His joke lightened the mood a bit, but deep down, I knew what I saw, and it wasn't my own reflection. After clearing the bathrooms, we headed into one of the old screening rooms. The second we stepped in, the darkness swallowed us whole. The only light came was from our flashlights, and even that seemed weak against the thick blackness around us. We walked up the aisles, checking between the rows of seats. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We were about to call it when I saw it. A soft, eerie glow coming from somewhere up in the seating area. "Hold on a minute," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw her, a young woman glowing like she had her own light source, just walking slowly along the row of seats. Her body was almost transparent, like she was made of light and mist. I knew right away that she wasn't alive, but there was something so beautiful yet terrifying about her. She moved with this otherworldly grace, like she was floating rather than walking. She reached the end of the aisle and paused, like she was deciding where to go next. That's when my partner spoke up. "Miss, are you okay? Do you need any help?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence. The moment he spoke, her head snapped. "What the fa?" And I felt my blood turn to ice. Her eyes, they were pitch black, like they were swallowing the light. She looked right at us, or maybe through us, I don't know. But whatever she saw, it made her change. Her graceful movements turned jerky and twisted, like her limbs, oh my, were being yanked in directions they weren't meant to go. With every step, there was this sickening snap, like her bones were breaking with each movement. Then, she opened her mouth, but instead of words, this horrible, choking sound came out, like someone trying to scream through a throat full of blood. Dark veins started spreading from her eyes, crawling across her face, like cracks in porcelain. Her skin, once flawless, seemed to be crumbling before our eyes. Then her hands, they started turning black, like ink was spilling over her skin. She looked at her own hand, her face twisting in fear, or maybe pain. The light around her flickered, almost going out, before it flared up again. But it wasn't the same. The beautiful young woman we saw moments ago was gone, replaced by something twisted and wrong. The blackness spread until her entire body was consumed. And then she let out this piercing scream, a sound so full of pain and rage it made my ears ring. But then, just as suddenly, the light snuffed out, leaving behind a swirling mass of shadow, darker than the rest of the room, darker than anything I've ever seen. Even our flashlights couldn't penetrate it. It moved toward us, the darkness itself creeping along the floor, and that awful choking sound came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. We didn't need any more convincing. We turned and bolted out of there, like the devil himself was on our heels. We ran for the car, not even bothering to replace the board over the entrance. I didn't stop running until I was in the driver's seat, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. We didn't say a single word to each other as we sped away from that cursed place. There was no need. We both knew what we saw. First a ghost, then something far worse. Something evil, something that shouldn't exist. To this day, me and my partner have never ever, talked about what happened in that theater. But I'll never forget it. Something terrible happened there, something we weren't meant to see. And whatever it was, it's still there, waiting in the dark. Just stay out of this freaking place. Some calls stay with you forever. They bury themselves deep in your mind, coming back to haunt you when you least expect it. I had one of those calls about 6 years ago. It was a cold winter day, and I was on duty with my partner, Officer Thompson. We got a call about a car accident, a bad one. A vehicle had lost control, flipped over a guardrail, and plunged into the icy river below. The driver was a 32-year-old woman, and she wasn't alone. Her 12-month-old son was in the back seat. When we arrived at the scene, it was already a mess. A crowd of onlookers had gathered, their cars parked haphazardly along the road. Some brave souls were trying to scale down the steep embankment to reach the car, but it was too dangerous. I've seen Good Samaritans turn into victims in situations like this, and I wasn't about to let that happen on my watch. The car had been in the water for a while. From the looks of it, we were probably dealing with a recovery mission rather than a rescue. We ran the plates and got the owner's info, but what we didn't know, what we couldn't have known, was that there was a baby strapped in the back. Just as we were calling for backup, we heard it, a woman's voice, faint but unmistakable, calling out from the wreckage. "Please, someone, my son is in here, help!" The voice cut through the noise, sending shivers down my spine. Thompson and I exchanged a look of disbelief. It didn't seem possible. How could anyone survive that crash? But there was no time to question it. We had to act fast. Every second counted. The woman's voice was desperate, pleading for us to save her son. As a father myself, those words hit me hard. I knew I'd do anything to get that kid out of there alive. We tied a rope to a nearby tree and started our descent down the embankment. The river was freezing, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you feel like you'll never be warm again. But there was no turning back. The car was upside down in the water, the trunk sticking out a little, higher than the hood. It gave me hope that the baby might still be alive. "Ma'am, we're almost there, just hold on," I shouted, hoping she could hear me. But the voice that had been so frantic before was now silent. My heart sank, but I pushed forward, wading through the icy water towards the driver's side. I had to know, was she still alive? When I got close enough to peer into the car, my blood ran cold. The front of the vehicle was mangled, nearly submerged in the river. The door was crushed, and from what I could see, the driver's seat was almost entirely underwater. But what I saw in that brief glance, through the shattered window, it didn't make sense. There was a body in the driver's seat, but it was clear, crystal clear, that the woman was dead. No one could survive that kind of impact, and even if she had, she would have drowned by now. But then, who was calling out to us? "Thompson, you got anyone else back there, besides the kid?" I called out, my voice shaking. "No, just the child. He's still strapped in the car seat. We're gonna have to cut him out. The door won't budge," he replied. My mind was racing. There was no one else in the car. The passenger seat was empty. The only people in that vehicle were the dead driver and the baby. But I know what I heard. That woman, she called out for help. I heard her, as clearly as I'm speaking to you now. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold water crept up my spine. I was frozen in place, trying to make sense of it all, when Thompson's voice snapped me back to reality. Hey, what's the status of the mother? Is she still alive over there? I didn't know how to answer him. I just shook my head, feeling the weight of what I was about to say. She's gone, Thompson. There's no way she made it. He looked at me, his face went pale as the realization set in. We both heard her, heard that woman pleading for her son's life, but there was no one left to cry for help. As I stood there, firefighters arrived, with the jaws of life, to free the baby from the wreckage. They managed to cut him out, and by some miracle, he was alive. Cold and scared, but alive. An ambulance was waiting, and they rushed him off to the hospital. Thompson came over to where I was standing, staring at the dead woman in the driver's seat. He was shaking his head, his voice barely above a whisper. There's no way she survived that, but we both heard her, right? I nodded, unable to speak. My mind was reeling, trying to piece together something that couldn't be explained. That voice, her voice was real. It had to be. But the woman was dead, long before we got to her. 6 years have passed since that day, and I still think about it all the time. I believe with everything in me that the boy's mother called out to us from beyond the grave. Her love for her child was so strong that even death couldn't stop her from saving him. It's the only explanation that makes any sense. That boy is alive today because of her. I'm sure of it. And every time I close my eyes, I can still hear her voice, begging us to save her son, even though she was already gone. Some things you just can't explain, but I know what I heard, and I know that love is more powerful than we can ever understand.